in the humid darkness of a Carolina swamp, where Spanish moss drapes like funeral shrouds and the air itself seems to breathe with ancient malevolence, something impossible happened on the night of September 13th, 1781. 27 Continental soldiers, battle-hardened veterans of Cowpens and Kings Mountain, encountered an entity that defied every natural law they understood. What began as a routine patrol through the treacherous wetlands near the Santee River became a supernatural battle that would haunt military records for centuries. The official report, sealed away in Colonial archives, speaks of an abomination of unholy proportions and combat against forces beyond mortal comprehension. Tonight, we uncover the terrifying truth behind America's most classified colonial encounter. The autumn of 1781 brought an unusual chill to the South Carolina lowlands, where the Revolutionary War still raged in brutal guerrilla campaigns. Captain Ezekiel Thornton of the 3rd South Carolina Regiment received orders that seemed routine enough. Lead a patrol for the Congaree Swamp to intercept British supply lines rumored to be moving through the waterways under cover of darkness. What made this mission different wasn't the objective. It was the timing and the growing whispers among local militiamen about something prowling the marshlands. Thornton assembled 26 of his most reliable men, veterans who had survived the bloodbaths at Camden and Eutaw Springs. These weren't green recruits prone to panic at shadows. Sergeant William Mackenzie had fought at Bunker Hill before joining the Southern Campaign. Corporal James Rutledge bore scars from 3 separate bayonet charges. Private Thomas Wainwright had earned his reputation as the regiment's best tracker, capable of following enemy movements through the most treacherous terrain. These were hardened soldiers who had faced British steel and Cherokee war parties with equal courage. The mission briefing took place in the ruins of a burned plantation house, its blackened timbers reaching toward the sky like accusing fingers. Major Harrison, their commanding officer, spread crude maps across a makeshift table constructed from charred beams. The candlelight flickered ominously as he traced their route with a weathered finger, following waterways that twisted to the heart of the swamp like a serpent's spine. Intelligence suggests the British are moving supplies through the interior channels, Harrison explained, his voice barely above a whisper. Small boats, probably at night, using the maze of waterways to avoid our patrols. Your job is to intercept and destroy any enemy traffic you encounter. He paused, glancing at the faces illuminated by the dancing flame. There have been reports from the area. Local militiamen speak of strange sounds, unusual animal behavior. I want you to investigate any unusual activity, but remember, your primary mission is to disrupt enemy supply lines. What Harrison didn't tell them was the content of the reports that had reached his desk over the previous weeks. Militia scouts spoke of enormous shapes moving through the water at night, leaving behind tracks that resembled nothing in any naturalist's journal. 2 separate patrols had returned with tales of glowing eyes the size of lanterns and sounds that made grown men weep with terror. A 3rd patrol hadn't returned at all. Those searchers later found their muskets arranged in a perfect circle around what appeared to be a massive crater in the swamp floor, as if something had erupted from beneath the earth itself. The local Catawba Indians, traditional allies of the Continental forces, had begun avoiding the entire region. Chief White Eagle, when pressed for information, would only say that the spirits of the deep water had awakened, and that wise men kept a higher ground when the moon grew dark. The tribal medicine man spoke of ancient warnings passed down through generations, stories of creatures that slept beneath the black water until disturbed by the violence of men. As Thornton Patrol prepared their equipment that evening, an unusual number of omens seemed to manifest. The horses grew restless, refusing to approach the swamp's edge despite their handlers' best efforts. Dogs that normally accompanied such missions whined and retreated, their hackles raised as they stared into the darkening wilderness. Even the local birds fell silent as the sun disappeared behind the canopy, creating an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against the soldiers' ears like a physical weight. Private Wainwright, examining his powder and shot by lamplight, noticed something that would later seem prophetic. His musketball molds had produced ammunition with unusual imperfections. Small crosses seemed to appear naturally in the lead, as if the metal itself was blessing the projectiles. Other soldiers reported similar anomalies. powder that sparkled in inner light, bayonets that hummed softly when drawn from their scabbards, and compass needles that spun wildly when pointed toward their intended route. The patrol departed at midnight, moving single file through terrain that seemed to shift and change with each step. Thornton led from the front, his experience noting details that would have escaped lesser woodsmen. The cypress trees grew larger as they penetrated deeper into the swamp, their massive trunks disappearing into the darkness above, like the pillars of some primordial cathedral. Spanish moss hung in thick curtains that muffled sound and created the illusion of walls where none existed. Water levels fluctuated unpredictably, forcing the soldiers to adapt their route constantly. What had been dry ground minutes earlier might suddenly become waist-deep channels, while solid-looking surfaces proved to be floating mats of vegetation that could barely support a man's weight. The air itself seemed thick enough to drink, carrying scents of decay and ancient earth that spoke of things long buried and best left undisturbed. Sergeant Mackenzie, bringing up the rear of the column, found himself constantly checking over his shoulder. His veteran instincts warned of pursuit, though no human tracker could have followed their winding path through the labyrinthine waterways. Something was indeed following them, but it moved beneath the surface, creating barely perceptible wakes that might have been mistaken for the natural flow of current if the water hadn't been perfectly still. The history of the Congaree Swamp stretched back millennia before European boots first squelched through its treacherous depths. Native American oral traditions, carefully preserved through generations of storytellers, spoke of the region as a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin. The Catawba called it Ihanupa, the sleeping mouth, believing that something vast and primordial slumbered beneath the black waters, dreaming dreams that occasionally bled into the waking world. Archaeological evidence, largely ignored by colonial authorities focused on more immediate concerns of war and survival, suggested that the area had been considered sacred and dangerous for over 1,000 years. Shell middens and ceremonial artifacts found along the higher ground indicated that native peoples had used the swamp's periphery for important rituals, but never ventured into its heart. Carved petroglyphs on ancient cypress stumps depicted serpentine forms of impossible size, their coils encompassing entire landscapes while human figures fled or prostrated themselves in apparent worship. The first European accounts of unusual activity in the region dated back to 1669, when Spanish explorers under Captain Diego Ramirez attempted to map the interior waterways. Ramirez's journal, discovered centuries later in the archives of Seville, contained increasingly frantic entries describing his expeditions and encounters with what he termed Las Bestias del Agua Profunda, the beasts of the deep water. His final entry, written in a shaking hand, described an attack by something that rose from the depths like a mountain of living shadow, with eyes that burned like stars fallen into hell. Of Ramirez's expedition of 32 men, only 7 returned to the coast, and these survivors were found wandering the marshlands in a state of complete madness. They spoke incoherently of battles against creatures that defied description, of waters that boiled without heat, and of a presence so ancient and malevolent that it had witnessed the formation of the continents themselves. The Spanish authorities, practical men concerned with gold and territory rather than supernatural speculation, dismissed these accounts as the ravings of men broken by disease and hardship. French trappers in the early 1700s added their own testimonies to the growing collection of unexplained encounters. Jean-Baptiste Couture, a veteran of the Great Lakes fur trade, established a temporary camp on the swamp's eastern edge in 1718. His trading post prospered briefly, serving as a way station for trappers and traders navigating the inland waterways. However, within 6 months, Couture abandoned his profitable enterprise and fled northward, leaving behind valuable furs and equipment. Couture's account, preserved in the records of French colonial administration, described nightly visits from something he could never clearly see, but always sense watching from the water. His Native American trading partners, members of various tribes, refused to approach his post after sunset, speaking in hushed tones of the Wendigo of the South, a creature that combined the worst aspects of various tribal monsters into a single, unprecedented threat. They warned Couture that his presence had awakened something that should have remained dormant, and that his very survival depended on immediate departure. The creature's influence seemed to extend beyond mere physical manifestations. Local wildlife began exhibiting unprecedented behaviors throughout the region. Alligators, normally apex predators comfortable in any aquatic environment, abandoned vast stretches of prime habitat. Snakes, including the massive water moccasins that typically thrived in such conditions, disappeared entirely from certain areas. Even the insects fell silent in zones that seemed to shift and change without apparent pattern. British military surveys conducted during the 1770s, as tensions with the colonies escalated, documented these anomalies with characteristic thoroughness. Captain Reginald Worthington of the Royal Engineers spent 3 months attempting to map potential defensive positions throughout the swamp system. His reports, filed with military precision, noted areas of unaccountable disturbance, where surveying instruments malfunctioned consistently, and where his men reported overwhelming feelings of dread that made accurate measurement impossible. Worthington's survey team encountered physical evidence that defied explanation. Enormous tree trunks, some with circumferences exceeding 20 feet, showed signs of having been twisted and broken by forces that appeared to originate from below. These ancient cypresses, survivors of centuries of hurricanes and floods, lay scattered like kindling in patterns that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than natural destruction. The wood itself bore unusual markings, deep grooves that spiraled around the trunks in mathematical precision, as if something had used them as tools for sharpening claws of unimaginable size. Water samples collected from the deepest channels revealed properties that baffled the era's rudimentary scientific understanding. The liquid appeared normal to casual observation, but exhibited unusual resistance to heating, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Fish caught in these areas showed anatomical abnormalities, additional fins arranged in symmetrical patterns, scales that grew in geometric designs, and eyes that appeared to track movement even after death. Local folklore began incorporating these scientific anomalies into increasingly elaborate mythologies. Stories spread to the colonial settlements of a creature that had existed since before human memory, a being so ancient that it remembered when the land itself was young. According to these tales, the creature had slept peacefully for generations, disturbed only by the most severe natural disasters. However, the violence and bloodshed of the Revolutionary War had begun to seep into its dreams, causing it to stir with increasing frequency and malevolent intent. The timing of these escalating encounters with the opening phases of the war seemed more than coincidental. Native American shamans, consulted by desperate colonial authorities, explained that violent death released spiritual energy that accumulated in places of natural power. The Congaree Swamp, already a confluence of mysterious forces, was becoming a magnet for the darker aspects of human conflict. Each battle, each skirmish, each act of brutality added to a growing reservoir of negative energy that threatened to awaken something that had slumbered since the world was young. Captain Thornton raised his fist, bringing the patrol to an immediate halt as the first signs of enemy activity became apparent through the Spanish moss curtains ahead. The soft splash of paddles cutting through black water echoed across the swamp's unnatural silence, accompanied by the muffled voices of men attempting stealth, but failing to account for the acoustic properties of the wetlands. Through gaps in the vegetation, the Continental soldiers could make out the silhouettes of 3 small boats moving single file through a narrow channel, their occupants clearly British from their distinctive military bearing and equipment profiles. Sergeant Mackenzie crept forward to join his captain, water reaching nearly to his waist as he navigated between the massive cypress buttresses that formed natural concealment. 12 men, maybe 15, he whispered, his experienced eye counting shapes in the dim starlight. Supply run by the look of it. Those boats are riding low with cargo. His assessment proved accurate. The British vessels carried ammunition, medical supplies, and gold intended to pay Cherokee warriors for continued raids against colonial settlements. The tactical situation appeared straightforward enough. Thornton's force held superior numbers and the advantage of concealment, while the enemy moved through a natural choke point with limited options for escape or maneuver. Standard military doctrine called for a simple ambush. Wait until the boats reached the narrowest section of the channel, then open fire from both banks simultaneously. The mission should have concluded within minutes. Another successful interdiction of enemy supplies to report in the morning dispatches. However, as the patrol settled into position along the water's edge, preparing for the attack, something began to change in the fundamental nature of their surroundings. The water temperature dropped noticeably, creating wisps of mist that hadn't existed moments before. More disturbing was the behavior of the swamp's wildlife. Creatures that had been maintaining their normal nocturnal chorus suddenly fell completely silent, as if every living thing in the area had simultaneously held its breath in anticipation of some unimaginable event. Private Wainwright, positioned on the eastern bank with his musket trained on the lead boat, felt the hair on his neck rise as an overwhelming sense of being watched settled over him like a burial shroud. His tracker's instincts, honed through years of wilderness survival, screamed warnings about predators in the vicinity, but when he scanned the surrounding area, nothing visible justified his growing unease. The sensation felt less like a human enemy and more like standing in the gaze of some vast, patient intelligence that viewed all human activity with the detached interest of a naturalist observing insects. Corporal Rutledge, crouched behind a fallen log on the opposite bank, experienced a similar phenomenon. His breathing became labored despite the lack of physical exertion, and his hands trembled with an irrational fear that seemed to emanate from the water itself rather than from any external threat. The black surface, previously still as glass, began to show subtle movement patterns that defied the area's complete lack of current. Concentric ripples appeared and disappeared without apparent cause, as if something massive was stirring in the depths far below. The British boats continued their approach, their occupants completely unaware that they were paddling toward what would become the most extraordinary military engagement in colonial history. Lieutenant Edmund Blackwood commanded the small flotilla, a competent officer whose primary concern was maintaining silence as they navigated through territory known to be contested by rebel forces. His intelligence reports mentioned increased Continental Army activity in the region, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to emerge from the primordial depths of the Congaree Swamp. As the lead boat entered the killing zone, Captain Thornton prepared to give the signal for his men to open fire. His right hand rose slowly, ready to drop in the gesture that would initiate the ambush, when the water around the British vessels began to glow with a sickly phosphorescent light. The illumination started as barely perceptible wisps beneath the surface, but quickly intensified into an eerie green radiance that outlined something of enormous proportions moving directly below the enemy boats. Lieutenant Blackwood noticed the strange light first, pointing it out to his men with curiosity rather than alarm. Phosphorescent algae were not unknown in coastal waters, though rarely encountered this far inland. His casual observation transformed into screaming terror as the water around his boat began to churn violently, and something the size of a cathedral spire breached the surface less than 20 yards from his position. The creature that emerged defied every category of natural history known to 18th century science. Its serpentine form stretched over 100 feet in length, with a diameter that suggested it could easily crush the largest warships in the Continental Navy. Scales the size of dinner plates reflected the phosphorescent light like armor plating, while bony ridges along its spine created a silhouette that resembled the backbone of some prehistoric leviathan. Most terrifying of all were its eyes, orbs of burning amber larger than carriage wheels, possessing an intelligence that was ancient, alien, and utterly malevolent. The Continental soldiers, trained to face human enemies with firearms and blade, found themselves confronting something that challenged their understanding of reality itself. Private Daniel Cooper, a devout Methodist who had never missed Sunday services when circumstances allowed, began reciting the Lord's Prayer in a voice that grew higher and more frantic with each word. Sergeant Mackenzie, whose courage had been tested in a dozen battles, felt his hand shake so violently that he nearly dropped his musket into the swamp water. Captain Thornton, his mind struggling to process the impossible scene unfolding before him, managed to maintain enough presence of command to recognize that his mission parameters had fundamentally changed. The British supply boats, originally his primary target, had become fellow human beings facing a threat that transcended national conflicts and political differences. In that moment of crystal clarity, he made a decision that would define his character for the remainder of his life. Regardless of the consequences, he would not allow any man, enemy, or ally to face such a horror alone. The creature's head, resembling a massive serpent skull but adorned with additional features that belonged to no earthly species, swiveled toward the terrified British soldiers with predatory focus. Rows of teeth, each longer than a cavalry saber, became visible as the beast opened its maw in what might have been preparation to feed, or simply a threat display designed to paralyze its prey with fear. The sound that emerged from his throat was unlike anything the assembled men had ever heard. Part roar, part hiss, and part something else entirely that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly within the human soul. Lieutenant Blackwood's composure, maintained through years of military training and combat experience, shattered completely as the creature's massive head descended toward his boat with deliberate, predatory intent. His men, seasoned veterans of campaigns from the Caribbean to the Carolinas, abandoned all pretense of military discipline and began rowing frantically toward either shore, their previous concerns about rebel ambushes utterly forgotten in the face of this primordial nightmare. The wooden planking of their vessels groaned ominously under the pressure waves created by the beast's movement through the water. Captain Thornton found himself facing an impossible decision that transcended every military protocol he had ever learned. His sworn enemies were about to be devoured by something that represented a threat to humanity itself, while his own men looked to him for orders that no training had prepared him to give. The creature's phosphorescent glow intensified as it focused on the British boats, and in that hellish illumination, Thornton could see the raw terror on faces that had previously belonged to faceless enemies. "Open fire on that thing." Thornton's command rang across the swamp with the authority of absolute conviction. "All men, concentrate your fire on the creature. The British are no longer our enemies tonight." His decision to protect enemy soldiers would later be questioned by military tribunals, but in that moment, faced with something that challenged the very nature of human existence, such considerations seemed petty beyond measure. The Continental soldiers responded to their captain's order with the precision of veteran troops, despite the unprecedented nature of their target. Musket fire erupted from both banks simultaneously, muzzle flashes creating strobing light that illuminated the scene in stark, terrifying detail. The creature's scales, each the size of a warrior's shield, deflected most of the lead balls harmlessly, though several shots found softer tissue around the beast's eyes and caused it to rear back with sound that combined pain with ancient rage. Lieutenant Blackwood, realizing that the rebel soldiers were defending rather than attacking his men, made his own impossible decision. "Return fire in support of the Colonials," he shouted to his men, who were too terrified to question orders that would have been treasonous under normal circumstances. British Brown Bess muskets joined the Continental Army's weapons in a combined barrage directed at humanity's common enemy, creating the most unusual alliance in military history. The creature's response to this coordinated attack revealed an intelligence that was both alien and terrifyingly sophisticated. Rather than simply attempting to crush or devour its tormentors, it began using the swamp itself as a weapon. Massive coils, portions of its body that had remained hidden beneath the surface, erupted around the British boats and began creating whirlpools designed to drag the vessels and their occupants into the depths. Water displaced by its movements created artificial currents that threatened to sweep the Continental soldiers from their positions along the banks. Sergeant Mackenzie, his military instincts overriding his supernatural terror, began directing covering fire to allow the British soldiers to reach the shoreline. "Sustain volleys, boys. Keep that thing's attention while the redcoats get to solid ground." His pragmatic approach to the situation, treating it as a standard evacuation under fire, helped maintain some semblance of military order among men who were facing the impossible. Private Wainwright, whose tracking skills had identified countless human enemies in the past, found his expertise utterly inadequate for predicting the creature's movements. Its head would appear in one location only to strike from an entirely different direction, as if the beast possessed multiple attack points or could move through dimensions that human perception couldn't follow. His carefully aimed shots seemed to hit their mark, but the creature showed no signs of significant injury, despite dozens of musket balls finding their target. The British soldiers, abandoning their supply boats to the creature's wrath, struggled to the chest-deep water toward the eastern bank where Continental forces were providing covering fire. Corporal James Whitmore of His Majesty's 23rd Regiment of Foot found himself being hauled from the water by Private Thomas Jenkins of the 3rd South Carolina. Enemies turned allies through circumstances that would have been inconceivable hours earlier. Their mutual expressions of gratitude were interrupted by the creature's tail, a appendage the thickness of an ancient oak, which smashed through the space they had occupied seconds before. The beast's attacks seemed calculated to inspire maximum terror, rather than achieve quick kills. It possessed the power to destroy all the assembled humans within moments, but instead chose to toy with them, perhaps savoring their fear or testing their responses for reasons comprehensible only to its alien intelligence. When soldiers clustered together for mutual support, it would attack from unexpected angles, forcing them to scatter. When they spread out to avoid concentrated targets, it would strike at isolated individuals, forcing the others to choose between personal safety and collective defense. Captain Thornton and Lieutenant Blackwood, now fighting side by side behind a massive cypress buttress, attempted to coordinate their combined forces against an enemy that defied conventional tactical analysis. "Your men are good soldiers," Blackwood gasped between shots, his aristocratic accent strained by exertion and terror. "I've never seen Colonials maintain discipline under such unusual circumstances." Thornton's reply was interrupted by another attack that sent both officers diving for cover as claws the size of ship anchors raked the air where they had been standing. The creature's eyes, those terrible orbs of burning amber, seemed to focus on individual soldiers with personal malevolence, as if it was cataloging each human face for future reference. Men who met its gaze directly reported later that they felt as if their souls were being weighed and found wanting by something that predated human civilization by eons. Several soldiers, overcome by the intensity of that alien intelligence, began weeping openly while continuing to fire their weapons with mechanical precision. As the battle continued, it became apparent that conventional weapons were having minimal effect on their supernatural opponent. The creature bore dozens of musket ball wounds without showing significant distress, and its movements remained as fluid and powerful as when the encounter had begun. More disturbing still, the phosphorescent glow emanating from its scales seemed to be intensifying rather than dimming, suggesting that the combat was somehow energizing rather than weakening the beast. Private Cooper, still reciting prayers between shots, noticed something that would prove crucial to their survival. Each time combined forces achieved a truly coordinated volley, British and Continental soldiers firing simultaneously with perfect timing. The creature's glow flickered briefly, and its attacks became less precise for several seconds afterward. Whether this represented actual injury, disruption of some supernatural energy, or a simple surprise at effective human cooperation remained unclear, but it suggested a possible strategy for survival. The turning point came when Private Wainwright, his trackers, finally discerning a pattern in the creature's seemingly random attacks, recognized the tactical significance of their temporary alliance. "Captain," he called across the chaos of musket fire and inhuman roaring, "the beast retreats when we fire together. It fears unity more than our weapons." His observation, shouted over the sounds of supernatural combat, provided the first strategic insight that offered hope for human survival. Captain Thornton, seizing upon this crucial intelligence, began coordinating combined volleys with military precision despite the unprecedented nature of their situation. "Continental and British forces will fire alternating volleys on my command." His orders carried across both banks with the authority of absolute command. First volley, British forces ready fire. The disciplined crash of Brown Bess muskets echoed across the swamp, followed immediately by Thornton's second command. Continental forces ready fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Each coordinated volley caused the creature's phosphorescent glow to flicker and dim, while its attacks became noticeably less accurate and powerful. More significantly, the beast began showing signs of what could only be described as confusion, its ancient intelligence apparently unable to process the concept of natural enemies cooperating against a common threat. Its movements became hesitant, almost experimental, as if it was testing the reality of what it was witnessing. Lieutenant Blackwood, his tactical mind grasping the implications despite his terror, began refining the strategy with input from both British and Continental sergeants. Concentrated fire on the head and eyes, he shouted, his voice carrying clearly across the water. Maintain the alternating pattern. Don't let it anticipate our timing. The unusual sight of British and American officers coordinating their forces would have been remarkable under any circumstances, but witnessing it during combat against a supernatural entity elevated the moment to something approaching the mythological. As the battle evolved into a more structured engagement, disturbing details about the creature's true nature began to emerge. Sergeant Mackenzie, observing the beast's behavior with a veteran's eye for enemy patterns, noticed that its wounds were healing with visible speed. Musket balls that had penetrated its hide were being expelled by some internal process, while tears in its scales sealed themselves as the soldiers watched. "It's repairing itself," he called to Captain Thornton. "Every injury we inflict is temporary." More unsettling still was the creature's apparent ability to learn from their tactics. After several successful coordinated volleys, it began timing its attacks to disrupt their rhythm, striking just as soldiers were reloading or repositioning. Its intelligence was not only ancient but adaptive, capable of analyzing human military behavior and developing countermeasures within minutes of exposure to new strategies. The beast was, in essence, conducting its own tactical evolution in real time. Private Cooper, whose religious faith had sustained him through the darkest moments of the encounter, experienced what he would later describe as a divine revelation while reloading his musket behind a fallen log. The creature's reaction to unified human action suggested that it drew power from conflict and division, feeding on the negative energy generated by warfare and hatred. Their temporary alliance was not merely tactically effective. It was spiritually antithetical to the beast's very existence. "It feeds on our divisions," Cooper shouted, his voice carrying with evangelical fervor. "Every time we fight each other, we strengthen it. Unity weakens the beast more than bullets." His theological insight, delivered in the midst of supernatural combat, provided a framework for understanding why their alliance was proving effective against an enemy that conventional weapons could barely harm. The creature, as if recognizing that its nature was being revealed, launched its most devastating attack yet. Rising to its full height, a terrifying spectacle that dwarfed the surrounding trees, it released a sound that was part roar, part scream, and part something else entirely, a vocalization that seemed designed to shatter human sanity through sheer alien wrongness. Several soldiers collapsed immediately, blood streaming from their ears, while others found themselves temporarily paralyzed by the psychic assault. In that moment of maximum vulnerability, when human unity threatened to dissolve under supernatural pressure, an unexpected hero emerged. Lieutenant Blackwood, his aristocratic upbringing having instilled in him a rigid code of honor that transcended national loyalties, threw himself in front of Private Jenkins as the creature's massive claw descended toward the injured Continental soldier. The British officer's sacrifice, protecting an enemy soldier at the cost of his own life, created a moment of moral clarity that resonated through both forces. Captain Thornton, witnessing this act of ultimate courage, felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the conflict they were fighting. The Revolutionary War, with all its political complexities and national aspirations, suddenly seemed secondary to the broader struggle between human dignity and the primordial forces that sought to destroy it. In that instant of recognition, he made a decision that would define not only the remainder of the battle, but the rest of his life. Form square. Thornton commanded, using a tactical formation that required absolute trust between soldiers. British and Continental forces, alternating positions. Blackwood's sacrifice will not be meaningless. The square formation, typically used against cavalry charges, had never been attempted against a supernatural entity, but it represented the ultimate expression of military unity, soldiers depending entirely on their comrades for mutual protection. The formation came together with remarkable precision, considering that half the participants were technically enemy combatants. British and American soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their muskets creating overlapping fields of fire, while their bayonets formed a bristling perimeter of steel. More importantly, their unity was now founded on something deeper than tactical necessity. It was based on shared recognition of human worth that transcended political boundaries. The creature's reaction to this ultimate expression of human cooperation was immediate and violent. Its phosphorescent glow began to flicker erratically, and for the first time in the engagement, it showed signs of genuine distress. The beast's attacks became increasingly desperate and uncoordinated, as if the sight of natural enemies standing together in perfect trust was causing it physical pain. Ancient intelligence met human virtue, and for the first time in millennia, the outcome was genuinely uncertain. The square formation held with iron discipline as the creature circled them like a primordial shark, its massive form creating waves that lapped against the soldiers' legs while its burning eyes searched for any sign of weakness in their human unity. The beast had fed on centuries of human conflict, drawing strength from every war, every betrayal, every moment when mankind chose division over cooperation. Now, Faced with the unprecedented sight of natural enemies standing in perfect trust, its ancient understanding of human nature was being fundamentally challenged. Captain Thornton, maintaining his position at the square center, called out fire commands with metronomic precision, while Lieutenant Blackwood's sacrifice continued to inspire both British and Continental soldiers. First rank, fire. Second rank, ready? The volleys crashed out in perfect sequence, each coordinated discharge causing the creature's supernatural glow to dim further. More significantly, the beast's wounds were no longer healing with their previous speed. The unity of human purpose seemed to be disrupting its regenerative abilities. Sergeant Mackenzie, his veterans eye-noting details that others might miss during the chaos of supernatural combat, observed that the creature's attacks were becoming increasingly predictable. "It's losing its cunning, Captain," he called out between volleys. "The thing fights like a mad animal now, not the calculating predator was before." His assessment proved accurate. Where the beast had previously demonstrated sophisticated tactical intelligence, it now relied on brute force and rage, repeatedly hurling itself against a disciplined square formation without apparent strategy. The phosphorescent illumination that had initially made the creature appear even more terrifying was now working to the soldiers' advantage. Every movement was clearly visible, allowing them to anticipate attacks and coordinate their defensive fire with maximum effectiveness. British Corporal James Whitmore, standing beside Continental Private Thomas Jenkins in a partnership that would have been impossible hours earlier, noted with professional satisfaction that their alternating fire pattern was achieving the kind of sustained rate that individual national forces could never maintain. As the battle continued, disturbing changes began manifesting in the creature's physical form. Its scales, previously reflecting light like polished armor, began to appear dull and brittle. The massive head, which had dominated the battlefield with its alien intelligence, now seemed somehow smaller, less imposing. Most significantly, those terrible burning eyes were losing their intensity, the amber fire dimming to a mere ember of their former malevolence. Private Cooper, his religious conviction providing a framework for understanding the supernatural forces at work, recognized what was occurring. "It's not just wounded, it's starving," he called out with evangelical certainty. "The beast feeds on our hatred and division, but we're giving it nothing to consume. Our unity is starving it to death." His theological interpretation, delivered amid the thunder of musket fire, provided crucial insight into their enemy's true vulnerability. The creature's desperation became increasingly apparent as it launched attack after attack against the impenetrable square formation. Each assault was met with disciplined volleys that never faltered, never broke rhythm, never allowed the beast to exploit human weakness or division. The soldiers had transcended their national identities, becoming something greater than some of their individual parts. They had become humanity united against the darkness that had plagued civilization since its inception. British Lieutenant Morrison, who had assumed command after Blackwood's sacrifice, found himself coordinating seamlessly with Continental officers in a display of military cooperation that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. "Concentrate fire on the head," he ordered, his voice carrying clearly above the chaos. "Every shot counts now. The beast is weakening." His assessment was confirmed by the creature's increasingly erratic movements and the way its phosphorescent glow continued to fade with each passing minute. The turning point came when the creature, driven to madness by its inability to break the human formation or feed on their conflicts, launched what appeared to be a final, suicidal assault. Rising to its full height, the beast prepared to crash down upon the square with enough force to crush every soldier beneath its massive bulk. In that moment, when physical destruction seemed inevitable regardless of their spiritual unity, something remarkable occurred. Every soldier in the formation, British and Continental alike, raised their weapons in perfect synchronization without any verbal command. The moment represented the ultimate expression of human trust. Men who had been trained to kill each other now moved as a single entity, their actions coordinated by nothing more than shared purpose and mutual respect. The volley that erupted from their combined weapons was unlike anything heard on any battlefield in human history. The effect on the creature was instantaneous and devastating. The coordinated discharge of nearly 30 muskets, fired by soldiers united in perfect brotherhood, struck the beast like a physical blow from the hand of divinity itself. The phosphorescent glow that had illuminated the battlefield for hours suddenly winked out entirely, plunging the swamp into natural darkness. The creature's roar, pain, and rage transformed into something else entirely. A sound of ancient defeat, a primordial hunger finally denied. As silence settled over the battlefield, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against cypress roots, the soldiers maintained their formation while their eyes adjusted to the sudden absence of supernatural illumination. The beast had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only disturbed water and the lingering memory of burning amber eyes. However, evidence of the encounter remained. Trees bearing claw marks the size of ship anchors, and water that would glow with faint phosphorescence for decades afterward. Captain Thornton, his voice carrying clearly in a natural quiet that had replaced supernatural chaos, issued his final command of the engagement. Order arms. Stand down. The formal military phrase seemed inadequate to mark the end of such an extraordinary battle, but it served to return the soldiers to their human identities after transcending them in the face of impossible circumstances. The immediate aftermath of the battle was marked by a strange mixture of exhaustion, relief, and awkward recognition of their return to technically hostile status. British and Continental soldiers who had stood shoulder to shoulder against humanity's ancient enemy now faced the uncomfortable reality that they would likely be shooting at each other again within days or weeks, depending on the movements of their respective armies. The official reports filed in the aftermath of the Congaree Swamp encounter presented military historians with documents unlike anything in the annals of warfare. Captain Thornton's account, submitted to Continental Army headquarters 3 days after the battle, represented a masterpiece of understated military prose attempting to describe events that defied rational explanation. His report, classified immediately upon receipt and sealed in archives for over 2 centuries, began with the standard format of enemy contact and engagement, but quickly evolved into something approaching mythology. At approximately 0200 hours on September 14th, patrol elements encountered hostile forces of unknown origin and unprecedented capabilities, Thornton wrote, his careful military language struggling to convey the supernatural nature of their opponent. Enemy demonstrated resistance to conventional weapons and employed tactics outside standard military doctrine. Temporary tactical alliance with British forces proved necessary for mission completion and personnel survival. The report continued for 12 pages, each paragraph growing more extraordinary while maintaining the dry, professional tone required by military bureaucracy. Lieutenant Morrison's corresponding British report, filed with His Majesty's forces in Charleston, provided a remarkably consistent account that corroborated every major detail of the American version. Encountered unprecedented enemy entity while conducting supply mission through interior waterways. His document began with characteristic British understatement. Creature of unknown classification attacked vessels with apparent intent to destroy all personnel. Colonial forces provided crucial assistance, resulting in successful resolution of engagement. Both reports were immediately classified at the highest levels, deemed too sensitive for general military consumption. The physical evidence left behind by the encounter proved as problematic for military authorities as the written accounts. The abandoned British supply boats, recovered the following day, bore damage that no earthly creature could have inflicted. Massive puncture wounds in the hull planking appeared to have been caused by teeth the size of cavalry sabers, while claw marks in the wooden gunwale suggested appendages of impossible dimensions. Most disturbing were the perfectly preserved scales, each the size of a dinner plate, found embedded in the boat timbers like evidence from a naturalist's nightmare. Sergeant Mackenzie, tasked with collecting physical evidence for his report, discovered additional anomalies that challenged scientific understanding. The water in the immediate area of the encounter retained a faint phosphorescent quality that persisted for weeks afterward, visible only in complete darkness, but detectable by any observer brave enough to venture into the swamp at night. Samples collected in glass vials maintained this property indefinitely, leading to speculation that the creature had altered the fundamental nature of the water through some unknown process. The cypress trees bearing claw marks presented their own mysteries to investigators. The gouges, carved into wood with mathematical precision, appear to contain trace amount of an unknown substance that glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the water samples. More disturbing still, The wounds in the living trees showed no signs of natural healing, remaining as fresh decades later as they had been immediately after the encounter. Local woodsmen began avoiding the area entirely, reporting that the marked trees created feelings of intense unease in anyone who approached them. Continental Army intelligence officers, attempting to determine whether the British had employed some form of secret weapon during the encounter, interviewed every surviving soldier separately and extensively. The consistency of their accounts, despite significant differences in education, background, and military experience, suggested either an elaborate conspiracy involving enemy agents or the occurrence of genuinely supernatural events. Given the political climate of 1781, many officers found conspiracy theory more palatable than accepting supernatural explanations. British military intelligence conducted their own parallel investigation with equally inconclusive results. Lieutenant Morrison and his surviving men were questioned repeatedly about possible Continental Army involvement in what appeared to be an elaborate ruse designed to capture British supplies through false cooperation. However, the genuine terror displayed by American soldiers during the encounter, combined with their willingness to risk their lives defending British personnel, argued against any form of deception or staged combat scenario. The broader implications of the encounter began manifesting in unexpected ways throughout both military organizations. Soldiers who had participated in the battle developed reputations as exceptionally reliable and trustworthy, their willingness to cooperate with former enemies under extreme circumstances marking them as men of unusual character. Several received promotions based partly on their demonstrated ability to maintain discipline under impossible conditions, while others found their accounts serving as informal leadership training for junior officers. More significantly, the Congaree Swamp encounter began influencing military thinking about the nature of warfare itself. Officers who read the classified reports, even those who questioned their supernatural elements, recognized the tactical value of cooperation between opposing forces when facing mutual threats. The concept of temporary battlefield alliances, previously considered treasonous under most circumstances, began appearing in strategic discussions as a potential option for extreme situations. The creature's apparent vulnerability to unified human action had profound implications for military theorists attempting to understand the psychological dimensions of combat. If an enemy could be weakened through cooperation and strengthened through division, then traditional concepts of warfare as purely adversarial competition required fundamental revision. Some forward-thinking officers began experimenting with training exercises that emphasized unit cohesion over individual heroics, though they rarely cited the Congaree Swamp incident as their inspiration. The personal relationships forged during the supernatural battle created lasting connections that transcended national loyalties. Several British and Continental soldiers maintained secret correspondence throughout the remainder of the war, sharing intelligence and even providing mutual assistance when circumstances allowed. These relationships, built on shared trauma and mutual respect, represented a form of international diplomacy that operated entirely outside official channels. Captain Thornton and Lieutenant Morrison, despite returning to their respective duties as enemy officers, developed a professional respect that influenced their subsequent military careers. Both men became known for their humane treatment of prisoners and their willingness to seek negotiated solutions to military problems when possible. Their shared experience of fighting alongside former enemies provided them with unique perspectives on the costs and benefits of armed conflict. The medical reports filed by Army surgeons treating soldiers who had participated in the encounter revealed additional anomalies that military medicine was unprepared to address. Men who had been exposed to the creature's phosphorescent glow showed no signs of physical injury, but many reported enhanced night vision that persisted for months afterward. Others claimed improved hearing and an unusual ability to sense approaching storms or changes in weather patterns, as if their encounter with the supernatural had awakened dormant human capabilities. The years following the Congaree Swamp encounter witnessed a gradual transformation in how both British and American military establishments approached the documentation and analysis of unusual battlefield events. What began as an isolated incident requiring maximum secrecy evolved into a case study that influenced military thinking for generations, though always within the highest classification levels and never acknowledged in public military discourse. Captain Thornton, promoted to major following his exemplary conduct during the supernatural engagement, spent the remainder of his military career developing protocols for what he termed asymmetric threat response, military procedures designed to address enemies that operated outside conventional parameters. His training manuals, classified for over a century, emphasize the critical importance of unit cohesion when facing opponents whose capabilities exceeded standard military understanding. Without explicitly referencing supernatural entities, his work prepared future officers for encounters that might challenge their fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare. Lieutenant Morrison, similarly promoted within the British military hierarchy, became a leading advocate for what the Crown's military theorists called collaborative battlefield doctrine. His reports to the War Office, carefully worded to avoid supernatural implications, argued that certain extreme tactical situations might require temporary alliances with opposing forces when both face mutual threats to human survival. This revolutionary thinking contributed to the development of prisoner exchange protocols and battlefield mercy agreements that would later influence international military law. The physical evidence from the encounter continued to generate controversy within scientific circles for decades after the war's conclusion. The phosphorescent water samples, preserved in the archives of both the Continental Army and British forces, retained their unusual properties long enough for post-war researchers to conduct extensive analysis. Dr. Benjamin Harrison, a natural philosopher associated with the American Philosophical Society, spent 3 years attempting to understand the water's unique characteristics before concluding that they represented properties of matter as yet unknown to natural science. The scales recovered from the British supply boats presented even greater challenges to scientific understanding. Each specimen, roughly circular and approximately 10 inches in diameter, possessed a crystalline structure that appeared organic, yet exhibited properties typically associated with mineral formations. When exposed to heat, they glowed with the same phosphorescent light witnessed during the encounter, but showed no signs of degradation or chemical change. Attempts to cut or damage the scales proved futile. They appeared to be constructed from material harder than any known substance. Dr. Morrison Patterson, the British Empire's leading authority on natural history, examined the scale specimens during a secret Royal Society investigation conducted in 1789. His conclusions, documented in papers that remained classified until the 20th century, suggested that the materials represented either biological formations from species unknown to current scientific classification or evidence of natural processes operating according to principles not yet discovered by human inquiry. Both possibilities challenge fundamental assumptions about the natural world. The marked cypress trees became the focus of ongoing investigation by both military and civilian researchers throughout the post-war period. The claw marks, preserved with supernatural permanence in the living wood, provided physical evidence that was impossible to dismiss or explain through conventional means. Measurements revealed that the gouges followed precise geometric patterns, as if carved by an intelligence capable of mathematical calculation rather than simple animal instinct. Local folklore surrounding the encounter site evolved into a complex mythology that blended Christian religious themes with Native American spiritual traditions and first-hand military accounts. The story of natural enemies uniting against supernatural evil resonated powerfully with communities still recovering from the divisions and traumas of the Revolutionary War. Churches throughout the Carolinas incorporated variations of the tale into sermons about the power of unity over division, while tribal elders used it to validate their ancient warnings about the spiritual dangers of excessive human conflict. The surviving soldiers from both sides of the encounter found themselves bound together by shared experience that transcended their former national loyalties. Several established businesses together following the war's conclusion, their partnerships built on trust forged during impossible circumstances. Others maintained lifelong correspondences that documented their ongoing struggles to process and understand their supernatural battlefield experience within the context of their conventional religious and philosophical beliefs. Private Cooper, whose religious insights had proven crucial during the battle, became a prominent Methodist preacher whose sermons drew congregants from throughout the southeastern colonies. His theological interpretation of the encounter, that human unity weakened supernatural evil, while division strengthened it, influenced Protestant thinking about the spiritual dimensions of political conflict. Cooper never spoke publicly about his military service, but his emphasis on brotherhood and cooperation reflected lessons learned during his confrontation with primordial malevolence. The classified nature of the official reports meant that the full story of the Congaree Swamp encounter remained hidden from public knowledge for over 2 centuries. However, fragments of the tale emerged through family histories, local legends, and the occasional declassification of peripheral military documents. These partial accounts created a rich tradition of supernatural folklore that influenced American literature, particularly in the South, where writers like Edgar Allan Poe and later authors drew inspiration from stories of Revolutionary War soldiers facing otherworldly enemies. Military historians studying the Revolutionary War's lesser-known engagements occasionally encounter references to the September 1781 unusual enemy contact in the South Carolina interior, but the classification levels and missing documentation prevented comprehensive analysis. The few researchers who gained access to partial files found themselves confronting accounts that challenged their professional understanding of historical documentation and military reporting standards. The long-term psychological effects on the encounter's participants provided early insights into what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. However, the supernatural nature of their trauma created symptoms that conventional military medicine was unprepared to treat. Many veterans reported recurring dreams of phosphorescent light and burning amber eyes, while others developed phobias related to large bodies of water or encounters with unexplained phenomena. The Congaree Swamp itself gradually returned to its natural state, though subtle changes persisted for generations. Wildlife populations that had fled during the encounter were slow to return, and even decades later, certain areas remained unusually quiet and avoided by local fauna. The phosphorescent quality of the water faded gradually but never disappeared entirely, creating a tourist attraction for brave visitors willing to venture into the swamp during moonless nights. As the new American nation developed its military institutions and traditions, the lessons learned during the supernatural encounter were quietly incorporated into training protocols and leadership development programs. The emphasis on unit cohesion, mutual support, and the ability to cooperate with former enemies when facing common threats became hallmarks of American military doctrine, though their supernatural origins remain forever classified in the deepest archives of military history.